Thank you, Paris. We've learned new information about the massive police investigation at a South Hadley apartment complex over the weekend. The 33-year-old man arrested in the case faced a judge this morning after police seized numerous chemicals from his apartment. Western Mass News reporter Kristen Burnell now joins us live in the studio with the latest. Kristen?
Matt, Paul Traficante was arraigned in court this morning, but will not face any criminal charges regarding those chemicals that were seized from his apartment.
33-year-old Paul Traficante of South Hadley faced a judge on Tuesday after numerous statewide agencies acted on a search warrant over the weekend at his apartment on Riverboat Village Road.
Mr. Traficante was charged late Saturday into Sunday morning on 2 counts. The first being a felony would be possession of a large capacity magazine and also improper storage of a firearm, which is a misdemeanor.
Western Mass News spoke with the assistant district attorney at the Northwestern District Attorney's Office. He tells us Traficante did have a license to carry, but during their search of his apartment, they also discovered hydrogen peroxide, sulfuric acid, and potassium nitrate, chemicals he says were concerning.
Based on a very thorough investigation, there doesn't appear to be any nefarious intent with Mr. Traficante in these particular items. It does appear, and based on his statements in our investigation, that he was using these items to strip gold from computer keyboards, and there was evidence of that actually in the apartment.
Attorney Covington says all of the chemicals and the firearms have been removed from his apartment, and there are no pending criminal charges involving the chemicals in this case.
Having propane tanks and these types of chemicals in an apartment complex like Riverboat Village, where many of the apartments are very close to one another, we were very concerned about the flammable substance and the possibility that if something ignited, there could have been massive property and or damage to life and health.
And as for the conditions Traficante must follow going forward,
he's not to possess a license to carry or firearms identification card. He's not to possess any firearms or ammunitions or magazines. He's also not to construct or be in possession of a at-home chemistry lab or anything to that effect. And he's not to possess any knives or swords outside of your typical kitchen knives.
Traficante is scheduled to appear in court on May 23rd for a pretrial hearing on the gun-related charges. Reporting live in studio, Kristen Burnell, Western Mass News.